the Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am very excited to welcome back to the show Dr. James Taffe. James, welcome back.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, so I think this is like your third time back on the show. The first time we talked about Jane Boleyn, and then we talked about the Tudors and Christmas, right?
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Yeah, and today we're going to be talking about Serving the Tudors, your new book. And, I'm kind of curious, just to start off, did your book about Jane Boleyn kind of inspire this one in any way?
Oh, well, yeah, I think my interest in Jane sort of came from when I was studying Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. But then what really drew me to the whole story was the fact that she was a servant, yes, and that she was essentially a servant to a royal mistress. And that dynamic has always fascinated me. So yeah, I would say that Jane is an early inspiration for sure.
Okay, so let's just kind of start from the beginning when it comes to royal servants. And the most basic part of it, how did somebody go about becoming a servant in a royal household? Was it by birth? Were they appointed? How did somebody get that position?
Sure, yes. So I usually come back to the same point, which is it was who you knew rather than what you could do. Because a lot of the duties that they performed as servants were quite menial and quite simple. There weren't really many qualifications for being a servant. But usually an appointment would be off the back of like a petition or just someone, asking or pleading with the king or the queen or whoever it was to be in their household. So it really is who you knew as opposed to, how qualified you were.
Okay. And if somebody died while they were in that position, is it the same circumstances then?
I would say so, yes. I mean, definitely when kings and queens first came to the throne, they had to select an entire household. So there was a lot more kind of picking and choosing, I would imagine, and trying to find the right fit. But when there was just one vacancy and that needed to be filled, I would imagine quite often they already knew who was going to fill it because you do see in petitions people asking for offices that aren't actually even vacant yet. It's almost a bit morbid. Like, we know that your Lord Steward is particularly unwell, so I would make a great Lord Steward, and they don't hesitate. They just go straight in there, and they're not subtle. So I think most places were spoken for before they even became available, really.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you wrote in your book that I found amusing reminded me of just the modern day workplace. And as an example, I'm going to use I worked in the radio industry for quite a few years. And I know in the radio industry, when a disc jockey was leaving, that as soon as that person vacated their office, it was like vultures. Everybody moved in and grabbed everything that they wanted out of that
I bet.
office. It kind of sounds like it was the same at Tudor Court.
Oh God, absolutely. The competition would have been fierce, absolutely fierce, because so much rode on it. Your interests and your family's interests and everything were invested in getting this position at court because if you were near to the king or the queen or, in the household of a prince or a princess, your interests were essentially represented because they could speak on your behalf or act on your behalf. So
Yeah.
yeah, very, very highly coveted were these places at court.
And okay, so when it came to appointments, obviously, if you were a servant of King Henry VIII, I would assume Henry VIII was the one who made the decision on who was in his household. Is that right?
I would say broadly speaking, yes. Anything that was particularly like a personal or an intimate appointment, so anyone who would have been around him day to day, I think he would have had a say in it. And I think he would have made a point about saying if he was unhappy with someone or wanted someone in particular to serve in his household. But because there were so many roles, I imagine that some of the lower down, less important roles, that Henry deferred those to his Lord Chamberlain or Vice Chamberlain, who did, according to the Eltham Ordinances of 1526, they did have the right to suggest and recommend people for an appointment. But most of the evidence does sort of suggest that masters and mistresses, the Tudors themselves, would have kind of had the most vocal say about who were actually surrounding them, which makes a lot of sense, really, because these are the people you're spending your day-to-day life with. So yeah.
Right. But Henry VIII, obviously, as we've learned, had a say in who some of the servants of his consorts were.
Oh, yes. I had a lot of fun with that when I was researching that because I mean it kind of makes sense, like it's his court. It's not really the consort's court. So he wants to have like a court fitting what he wants. But it is unfortunate that a lot of the time the political consequences and the personal consequences of Henry's opinion are very apparent in the evidence. Queens would have had to have been served by men and women that they weren't particularly fond of, but because they either were owed some obligation from a previous, like if their family had traditions in royal service, or if Henry was doing them a favor. Sometimes it was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber who asked Henry, could my wife or my daughter serve the Queen? The Queen didn't necessarily have to be particularly fond of them or even to like them. But if Henry said, this woman is going to serve in your chamber, that was it. I think he was fairer to some queens than others. Like I don't think he gave Anne of Cleves very much choice about it. She brought with her own servants and her own entourage from her home, and she wasn't really permitted to keep very many of those. Whereas I think when Catherine Howard became queen just after, I think she had a little bit more. She was indulged a little bit more about who she would prefer. So yeah. I think there's a general rule when it comes to appointments that the sovereign, whoever that is, male or female, had the last word.
Okay. One of the little tidbits of history that you shared in your book that I found interesting was about Henry Fitzroy, who, as
Right.
I'm assuming everybody who's listening knows, was the illegitimate yet recognized son of Henry VIII. And there was a story that you told, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Fitzroy dismissed one of his servants, and Henry VIII was not happy with this.
Yeah, that's correct. That was one of my favorite anecdotes in the book as well. So I think it's his cofferer, Sir
Yeah.
George Lawson, who is dismissed. And the letter essentially is a sort of chastising letter from Henry VIII to his son saying, we marvel at your decision to dismiss this man without consulting us first. And that was Henry's way of saying to his son, you're inexperienced and this person was appointed for a reason, and you can't just freely choose who to have in your household and who not to. No doubt, I think it's Sir George Lawson. He had some experience, or what Henry VIII might have been particularly fond of him. Like maybe they had a prior relationship. This is the fascinating thing about servants, is there are always so many prior relationships that you have to untangle. I mean, I imagine if I dug deep enough, Sir George Lawson didn't get this appointment as Fitzroy's cofferer by accident. He probably already has served Henry VIII or Henry VII or someone else of an equal status, in that capacity already. So yeah, that's a great little anecdote. That I think it's a good reminder that unless you were the sovereign king or queen, you didn't really have full control over your household.
Yeah, for sure. Is there any way that somebody could bribe their way into the household?
Undoubtedly, absolutely. I mean, there are instances where offices are sold off, that some servants were allowed to sell an office. Less so the offices that are attached to the royal household, but definitely does happen. It's usually more like offices that are attached to lands or estates and things like that. But every now and then I've come across one which it's someone selling an office within the royal household. And no doubt those sales or that kind of bargaining or bartering would only have been acceptable if the sovereign or the royal master or mistress approved it. So they said, yes, of course you can, if you want to trade off this office for this land or whatever it was, then it would have needed the approval of the master or mistress, no doubt. And that's the same for anyone who wanted to leave service. If you did kind of need permission, you couldn't just pick and choose when you wanted to leave. So yeah, I mean, bribery, no doubt that happened a lot. I don't know if I found a concrete case of bribery. There was a little bit of suggestion that Joan Boehmer, Catherine Howard's former acquaintance, may have bribed her way into the household by sort of suggesting that she knew a little bit too much about Catherine's reputation and background, and so she must take care of her. You must remember me and bring me into your household. But I think that theory is a little bit overstated because there isn't really enough to go on. But certainly the obligations were owed to people. So bribery in the form of like, I don't know, maybe passing someone some money, or it might not have even been necessary, even just bribing someone with information or guilting them into obligating whatever, into appointing them to their households. That definitely happened.
Well, let's use Anne Bassett as an example, right? I
Oh,
think
right.
if we think
Yes.
about the story of the quail eggs, I think that is a subtle form of bribery.
Oh, yeah, that was incredibly commonplace. Like no one appointment was given unconsciously or without, serious aggressive courting for that position because they were so because competition was so fierce that there was never a point where any appointment was taken for granted. Everyone had to petition and, as you say, bribe, court, flatter. They had to do anything within their power to convince them that this position was theirs.
Yeah. And it wasn't, I think one of the things that I used to misunderstand about being a servant, let's say in the consort's household, was that they had to provide their own attire. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, this is a question which has frustrated me to no end because it's very inconsistent. There are some suggestions, as like in the Lyle letters with Anne Bassett, that she would have to provide all of her own attire. But there are also surviving account books like a wardrobe account book for Catherine of Aragon, which shows that she often paid for silkwomen or for merchants for the material that she would have needed to attire her servants.
Mm.
There's enough of that in the accounts of the Lord Chamberlains, same with other of the Queen's consorts' households, which is probably where I'm most familiar. But you look at the King's accounts, like Henry VIII's accounts, and it's just the same. He always pays for material, draws up warrants for materials and gowns to be made up, and the livery coats, especially to have the right kind of embellishments, like the embroidered letters HR for Henry VIII and things like that. Just the material is so inconsistent in this regard, but I think the Lyle letters is the outlier in the sense of suggesting that servants had to pay for it themselves. The most straightforward way of answering it, I think, would be to say that we know at coronations and funerals, new livery had to be drawn up. And in those circumstances, they were given the material, but it was their responsibility to see that the coats were made up or the gowns were made up. So I think there's a sort of a middle ground there. They might have been given the materials as their right as part of the household, but not necessarily the gowns themselves. They would have to go and source that themselves and prepare in advance.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. That would be a
Yeah.
huge task, a huge undertaking.
I mean, the tailoring alone, everyone would have had different statures and oh yeah, I
Yeah.
can't imagine. Definitely kept all
Gosh.
those London companies in business, I'm sure.
I was just gonna say, now I have so many questions when it comes to the tailors and how did they keep up?
Oh, well, don't ask me. I'm not the expert. Yeah,
I will.
I'll give you a few names, but don't ask me.
I think maybe when it comes to the servants of the Tudors, the part that I've always wanted to understand better, and I'm gonna assume that my listeners do as well, is let's look at the consort as the center of an onion.
Okay,
Stick
okay,
with me here. Henry
okay.
VIII or Henry VIII or his consort is at the center of the onion, and his servants
Right.
or her servants are surrounding him. As we peel away the layers from the center of the onion, I'm going in reverse here, so it probably doesn't make much sense.
I'm
But
following you. I'm following you.
okay, so when we look at who is closest to the monarch or his queen and work our way out, who are the closest servants?
I do like this metaphor, I have to say. It makes perfect sense to me. Yes, so the center being the Tudors themselves, the closest would generally be the Privy Chamber, which is like a subsidiary of the chamber, which is anyone who served above stairs, really. The Privy Chamber being the most intimate and the most innermost servants, and they get their namesake from the fact that they served in the Privy Chamber, which was like the closest chamber to the bedchamber and sort of the more private and sort of intimate area where the king or queen or prince or princess would relax and sort of take solace. So there's definitely the Privy Chamber closest to the core, and then I would say the chamber on the next layer, possibly the household, which is the household below stairs. confusingly has the name household, but that would have been sort of the service departments like the scullery or the pantry or things like that. And they would not have been so close to the center in terms of they wouldn't necessarily have had day-to-day interaction, but there are exceptions to that. So that layer being fairly close to the center makes a lot of sense. And then if you want to take it even further, you could say that on the very outermost layer, the wardrobe, the stables, and then to confuse matters, there's the chapel, which some members of the chapel would never have interacted, but others would have interacted very directly with kings or queens. So it's never so cut and dry. It's not always so straightforward, but definitely, I like the layers. I think that makes sense. Privy chamber closest. And then, the definition of a servant can be so confusing. Some people refer to themselves as a servant, even though they're not really in the household. So trying to define a servant in the first place is a whole can of worms, which I don't even want to go into now. But in the book, I concentrate more so on servants who knew and interacted with the Tudors more personally, which would have been either the privy chamber or the chamber.
Okay. All right. Man, there are so many layers that go into
There are.
this. There is. I think I was reading, oh, now I'm going to forget the title exactly. Sir John Seymour was a groom of the chamber. Is that a right title? Does that sound right?
Well, that's definitely a title, the Groom of the Chamber, yeah. But you give me a name, and I've got
I know.
thousands
Okay.
of names in my head. Ooh, I couldn't tell you one way or the other.
I'm not so worried about whether or not he actually was. I guess my thing was trying to understand what it was a groom of a chamber did, and was it an
Right.
honorary title, or did they actually do something?
I see. Yeah. So all of the chamber roles were quite menial everyday duties, like running a bath, making the bed, dressing the Tudors, things like that. All very intimate sort of jobs. So these positions were probably the most sought after for that reason. They could develop a relationship with the Tudors for that alone. But none of these jobs had any particular challenging roles. Like the groom of the chamber would have been responsible for like cleaning and maintenance of the chamber, sometimes maybe bringing clothes or bed linens to the bed, but not necessarily being in charge of dressing the king or making the king's bed. That was more so the responsibility of the gentleman of the king's privy chamber. So grooms, not menial and certainly not just honorary. The more honorary titles are those who might serve, I think it's called in extraordinary, which means they don't serve daily. They just serve in like almost like a shift pattern. But when they are there, they are more so used in coronations or funerals, basically whenever they need the household to be large and kind of grand and magnificent. So none of the chamber roles, I would say, were honorary, but there are definitely some positions where you struggle to pin down exactly what their duties are. And I suspect that's because they weren't really that complicated. They were just a title, really. That's not to say they had no duties, but sometimes I think when I struggle to figure out exactly what someone did, it makes me think, were they doing anything? Or were they just enjoying the title and whatever perquisites came with that?
Yeah. So who would wear livery and who could just dress normally?
Right. Yeah, that's definitely an important distinction, although again, gets very confused in the material sometimes. So, strictly speaking, a servant could wear livery, and the whole point of that was they could be identified as a servant by the livery that they wore, because all of the kings and queens had their own specific colors and emblems. So, you could identify someone walking about court just from what they were wearing as a servant. But the definition of a servant, as I was saying before, so muddied and so confused, and there are some exceptions. So I struggle to recall exactly, but I think it's the officers of the works, which is a very specific kind of, I think they build rather than they don't serve.
Oh.
In my head, that's not a servant. They're really more in charge of like the works, essentially, like how I think buildings and things like that. And they petitioned for the right to wear Mary the First livery because of the connotations of wearing livery. It speaks to your relationship with the king or queen. So it was an advantage to wear it, like publicly. That would sort of evoke this idea that they have a relationship with the crown, and so that was advantageous in its own way. So you can see why people wanted to wear the livery, but there are instances in the material where people get refused the livery because they're not quite the right servant. And then there were exceptions made for like the officers of the works who, after a petition, Mary says, yes, of course they can wear it. So in a way, even though the rules seem very strict and for a good reason, there are exceptions. So it's often you find a material like that and you think, have I got this wrong? Like, have I, am I the one who's mistaken? But I think it's just that with households, because they're so personal, and livery and things like that, so personal, kings and queens, princes and princesses, they could make exceptions when they wanted to. It was for them to run. It was their ideas,
Yeah.
their rules. So whatever they said went, which has made it confusing for the historian occasionally. But I would say generally, livery is worn by a servant.
You know,
And
that
sorry, not to avoid confusion, but also if you were, say, an earl and you had retainers, so you had like 100 men in your retainer, they could wear the earl's livery. They could be defined as servants, but they could also just be retainers or people who live in their district. So the word livery sometimes even means like the food that you're entitled to. So I don't even want to go there with these definitions, but livery, in my opinion, should mean and generally means to define clothes that were worn.
wow, I feel like you just opened a can of worms right there, and we won't necessarily
Well,
go into that. But
yes, don't.
I'm intrigued by the fact I think you forget sometimes that even an earl had livery for his servants.
Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't strictly the Tudors' right to have their servants wear livery. Livery was something that noblemen and women had of their own. And there are so many rules and sort of statutes in this period about what servants can wear when they're not royal, because I think certain colors had to be protected so that
Yeah.
they definitely wear royal. And also, there were many issues about how many people in a band one nobleman or woman was allowed to retain for many reasons.
Oh.
But many of the statutes specifically refer to livery and say you can only have 20 servants wearing your livery at any one time. So yeah, they definitely could. Not something I've looked into too in detail, but I think the fact that the Tudors, I don't remember which reign it is. I think it's might be Henry VII, but the fact that they had to protect certain colors suggests that livery and its identification at court of this is a royal servant, and not just at court, but also in the kingdom, was obviously important to them. So
Yeah. Oh, we talk about the sumptuary laws, right? And one of the things that you
that's the
had
word.
you
Couldn't come to me.
had well, you have a lot of words going in your head when you're a historian and a
Oh,
writer.
too many.
But I remember you talking about the colors worn by Henry VII, which, if I recall, were like green and white. Does that sound right? And then you had mentioned Elizabeth of York, and I hadn't even considered that she would have her own colors. So can we talk about those colors and then maybe go into Henry VIII and his consorts as well?
Sure, yes. So I am like I have the memory of a goldfish. Without it in front of me, I couldn't tell you the colors. I believe Henry VII might be white and green, and I think Elizabeth of York's is like a murrey or a purple and another color. But
Okay.
yes, they do have their own distinctive colors and sometimes badges and emblems too. Sometimes phrases that are like embroidered onto the livery. Letters, as I think on the cover, there's a man wearing a red coat and it's got H and R, which is for
Yes.
Henricus Rex, and that's Henry VIII's livery. So yes, all the kings and queens would have had their own. I think the fact that they could fashion them, and I imagine they had a lot of choice in this because why wouldn't they? There's probably some tradition. I think some of Henry VIII's children sort of adopt livery colors from Henry VIII or Henry VII to sort of keep tradition. But again, not the expert in this. I would refer anyone to Maria Haywood's work on livery and dress at the Tudor court because that's where I sourced a lot of my own information on this. And yeah, I think the fact that they had different colors and badges and emblems just again lends itself to the importance of needing to identify and distinguish between them. And it kind of made servants feel more attached to kings or queens. I think this sense of identification and sort of cohesion of a household was clearly could be quite effective, I think, in especially when they were all banded together.
I could imagine how important you would feel to be wearing the king's livery, how that would not only make your status look great, just as a person, make you feel like, yeah, that's right. Look at me. I serve the king. Everybody knows it.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. There's the classic example is that Thomas Cromwell wanted the livery that was worn by the gentlemen of the King's Privy Chamber. Even though Thomas Cromwell wasn't strictly a Privy Chamber servant, he was a councillor, but he wanted to wear that livery. And that just speaks to the power of that livery and how important the gentlemen were and how they carried themselves, because Cromwell wanted it for himself. And he could have wore richer clothes and furs and things like that, but he wanted this uniform, surely for good reason. He doesn't say why, but he definitely chases up his agent to get the exact kind that the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber are wearing so that he can have some for himself. So yeah, I think that maybe a little bit some people wanted to show off, you know.
Yeah.
You can imagine walking about court or in the kingdom or in the localities where they're, you know, in their homes. That kind of thing would have spoke volumes, you know, that kind of status that came with it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So before Cromwell, there was Wolsey. And
Right.
you've
Yeah.
alluded a couple times to the 1526 ordinances. I don't know if it was
Yeah.
plural or not. Can you maybe go into that a little bit and what that was about? I've only skimmed over it a few times myself, but I'm going to assume that not many people are aware of what this was and what it meant.
Sure. Yes. So the ordinances of the household were the rules and regulations of the household, basically. In some respects, it lists the duties of a servant and what they were responsible for doing, but more often it's a list of rules and things that all servants had to abide by, and kind of the rules to living at court. And these rules have been around forever. I mean, the oldest ones that we can find on record date back to, I think, the 1100s, although it's been a
Wow.
while since I've looked at it, but they're quite old. And over time, new ordinances are introduced as and when it's felt necessary. And usually they're based on the last one. So there's always a foundation when new ordinances come out of what the rules should be. And the changes are made to sort of adjust to new lifestyle. So a lot of the changes in the out from ordinances are about privacy and about the Privy Chamber, and that's because that's a new innovation as far as Henry VII and Henry VIII. This idea and this need for privacy means that there needs to be new rules about who can go where and who can approach the king and when, and who can pass on this petition. And then there's rules about how many Privy Chamber gentlemen should be allowed in the chamber at one time. And then there's more classic ones like whether or not women are allowed to keep lapdogs. You know, there's all sorts of rules and regulations. But if you just look at the Alpha Ordinances of 1526, you don't necessarily get the full picture, because I think it takes for granted that there are loads of ordinances from, say, 1494 or 1471, and it borrows from them, and they form the foundation, they form the basis of what actually was allowed and what wasn't allowed at court. So as you say, with Wolsey, he in 1526, but actually originally in 1519, is tasked to reform the household just to address issues with like economizing it and keeping out any of sort of corruption, disorder, waste, and wanting to make it just more of an efficient operation. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not Wolsey seizes this opportunity to sort of put in his own creatures, is the word, into the household and abolish sort of and banish any of those who he doesn't really get on with famously. I won't wade into that debate just yet, but Wolsey was tasked with making sure the household ran efficiently. But as can tell from the rest of the Tudor period, that was not an easy task to actually to eliminate all inefficiency and all sort of disorder in the household was never possible. There was always constant issues, and we know this because Mary the First's comptroller, Sir Robert Rochester, and William Cecil for Elizabeth I were both again successively tasked with reforming the household and dealing with issues like overcrowding and people and waste. Waste was always a big issue, but they were always an issue in spite of the fact that these ordinances were implemented, which only suggests that they were not enforced severely enough, and that the court was a very chaotic institution and was not necessarily governed by these ordinances at all times.
Yeah. Wow, I have so many questions.
Oh no.
So who was allowed to have a place at court to stay? Where is the line drawn there?
Yes, another murky, difficult question to
Okay.
answer. I mean, It's definitely those who are needed on hand day to day have a right to lodgings. And that would generally be anyone in the chamber. I think it's safe to say that those in the lower sort of ranks of the household were also given lodgings as and when it was felt necessary. But when kings and queens went on progress, or if they stayed in the houses of noblemen and women, they couldn't possibly house the entire court all the time. And I think it's generally the most intimate servants who accompany them and who are entitled to lodgings at those times. The best example I can think of in terms of lodgings off the top, well, there's a few, because there are letters of complaint that have survived. So some servants are not happy with their lodgings and they petition for bigger lodgings or better lodgings, or lodgings that aren't so cold or so in disrepair. I think it's Mary Lady Sydney who refuses to come to court because her lodging is so cold and she's not a well woman. And she's shocked that she says that the Queen, who loves her so dearly, would never have her suffer in this chamber. So she writes to the Lord Chamberlain saying, "You need to find me a better place to live, a better place to reside." And then there's a secretary of Henry VIII who complains that he can't even really fit his desk in the lodging that he's got given, which is kind of an important thing for a secretary to be able to write down and keep all the correspondence moving. So yeah, it's difficult to define exactly who is entitled to what. And it's one of the few things that I don't feel is often in the records. They'll say who's entitled to have bread or ale, and it will often say how much people are being paid. But there's not always a specific definition about who has a right to actually live at court. And which makes me think that they just knew and it was taken for granted. And again, ordinances could be backdated several centuries. If something already existed and had been court practice for so many years, they never really felt the need to keep reiterating it and restating it all of the time. So they could have been using rules from the 1400s, but never felt the need to say so. And therefore, for me as a Tudor historian, how far do I delve into the medieval period to try and find my answers? And often I do find the answers and they're in the book, but really sort of close readers will notice that I skirt around issues where I don't know the answer, and we probably never will, because there's no real surviving record saying you are entitled to lodgings and you are not.
Yeah, this book was quite the undertaking, I can imagine. I'm so glad that you wrote it, because between your book and Dr. Nikki Clark's book on the ladies in
Oh, yes.
waiting, it's just opened up this whole new world to Tudor enthusiasts of where we didn't really know, right? Especially
I
if
I hope
you
so. I hope so.
yeah, if you don't have the ability to be able to dive as deep into the research records as historians are, it's a great way to be able to get an idea of what it really was like at Tudor court. And I don't know really of any other books like this.
I hope I that's what I think I wrote the book that I wanted to read. And there are no doubt there are historians who have worked on servants or on the Tudor royal household, but they work in more niche specific ways. Like you might find a thesis on Henry VIII's Privy Chamber, or you might find a thesis on Mary the First, ladies and gentlewomen. But how far they have to tackle specific issues of servants and service more broadly is another question. They've got other arguments that they want to make, and overall, I felt like there was a gap for this book. And as you mentioned, Nikki Clark's book, I would love to see more books like that, which really open up the Tudor world a little bit more. There's like an issue in sort of the Tudor historiography where it kind of gets a bit stagnant, and we might be talking about the same things and the same issues, but there are things we don't know still. And yeah, admittedly, the research was painstaking, and there's a lot of gaps in surviving source material, but there are still things we don't know. And that's what kind of motivates me to research and to write. I couldn't really get excited about this book if it was kind of something that we already knew or something that was already out there. I was really excited about how much of the original anecdotes, especially that I'd never heard. You know, there's really silly ones, like someone like a servant trying to get a license so that he can sell his cheese. I'm like, well, I've never heard about this. And I know it's silly and specific, but that's what the book is full of. It's full of these little anecdotes, which I think cast a new perspective on the Tudor court, especially.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. I feel like that
Thank
would
you.
be a perfect place for us to wrap up, but I'm not ready yet, James.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I'm here for it's a marathon.
It's a marathon. I hope you have the rest of your evening available.
Oh well. Oh,
No, I'm
is that
just
the
kidding.
time?
I am curious, and I don't know if you even know the answer to this, and if you don't, that's okay. But we talk about the royal households and what it takes to run these royal households. Who was in charge of planning everything when it came to moving from one castle or palace to another? Who was the head of that? Because somebody had to be in charge overall.
I do know the answer to this one more definitively. Thank God. I do know how to answer this one. So the Lord Chamberlain and the Vice Chamberlain, they were essentially in charge of the household above stairs, and they were responsible for arbitrating disputes, making appointments, but also for assigning lodgings. However, there's like a hierarchy where you have the Lord Chamberlain and then his deputy, the Vice Chamberlain, and then you have gentlemen ushers who seem to be one of the most important roles, I think, in at the Tudor court. They not only supervise yeomen, grooms, and pages lower down on the hierarchy, but they seem to undertake all manner of responsibilities. And one of the main ones that they do is traveling or arranging for somebody else to travel on their behalf to royal palaces or to noblemen and women's houses to see if it's suitable for the king or queen to stay there, to make sure that it's prepared properly. So gentlemen ushers have that role, and the account books are abundant with evidence of it. Won't necessarily say gentleman usher, but it will say the name of a servant, and it will say they're riding on horseback and they're being refunded or reimbursed for 7 shillings because they traveled to Whitehall to ensure that it was properly prepared. You know they're a gentleman usher or acting on behalf of a gentleman usher when you read that. And there is an anecdote, and I will never remember the name of it off the top of my names of them off the top of my head, but there is an anecdote in the book about a gentleman usher who receives a letter from someone who is due to have a visit from Elizabeth I, and he pleads with the gentleman usher, saying, "Please, whatever you can do, don't let her come here because it's just going to be a massive expense, a right pain, no doubt, and just such a burden to have to accommodate and entertain Elizabeth and her court." And so the gentleman usher is definitely central to that, and he unfortunately has to write a letter back saying, "I'm afraid not. I couldn't do anything about it. The Queen's quite set on coming." So that was
Sorry.
unfortunate for him. Yeah. Can't remember their names, but it's a great little anecdote. That definitely made it into the book.
Yeah, how expensive. I can't even imagine. You would think some of these households could go bankrupt trying to keep up with
Oh,
this.
well, they did. I mean, that's the best thing about it is we have kings and queens. Well, not so much kings, but definitely queens and definitely princes and princesses who can't afford to pay the wages of their servants because, well, either because there's so much or they're so financially dependent on the sovereign and they're not being given enough. And there's
Yeah.
many letters. I think the best examples are Catherine of Aragon when she's a princess under Henry VII, or Margaret, Queen of Scots, had so many issues trying to pay her servants. I think she complains at one point that one of her own servants, one of her own comptrollers, has to sort of bail her out and pay her servants for her because Henry VIII hasn't given her enough to live on. And so, yeah, these households were absolutely very, very expensive. And often servants did go long periods without pay.
And yet they stayed loyal.
Well, I would say 90% of them did. Yes. There is a letter in the book where someone's like they're grieving the fact that Mary the First, when she's queen, hasn't paid them properly. But it wasn't really Mary's fault. She inherited a lot of debts from Edward VI, and Elizabeth inherited a lot of debts from her. That servants did go many years without being paid. And you can imagine why. You don't really want to kick up a fuss. You don't really want to cause any issues. You don't want to seem ungrateful for the position that you've been given. Wages were so meager anyway, a lot of the time, that the real advantage of having this position came from other perquisites, not just the wages. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I would say most people, as you say, they stayed loyal, and it is remarkable how many servants stayed with, for instance, Catherine of Aragon, even though they weren't being paid. And I mean, she says they were living in rags at one point. It's not quite the image of a household of a princess that we have, but if she didn't have any money, how was she how was she to pay for their livery? How were they to where were they going to subsidize themselves?
Right. And we hear of other consorts, Tudor consorts, who were borrowing money from their servants and then,
That's right. Yes.
upon their death had to pay them back.
It's brilliant because it doesn't, when you hear it, you think, surely not. But
Right.
that was the reality of it. Yeah. And
Yeah.
servants not only borrowing money from their masters or mistresses, but as you say, borrowing money to them. It's extraordinary, but that's what the records say.
Yeah. Yeah. This might be another odd question. I'm just going to keep saying that. I'm just going
Sure.
to set you up and just get you ready to be so nervous about trying to answer this. But,
Okay.
and this is a selfish question because in my own research on Thomas Seymour, um, in the records, it says that he delivered messages between Sir Francis Bryan and the king when Bryan was an ambassador to France. And I've
Right.
always wanted to understand what that looks like. Is that a subject that you're familiar with at all?
Sort of. As far as I had to be interested in it, because it's diplomacy and sort of international relations, not quite my, I wouldn't say it's not my expertise because I've done
Yeah.
enough on it in terms of servants, but it's not my favorite thing to research. So I sort of like sat down one weekend and thought, all right, I've got to get this chapter done because I just didn't know enough about it. And thankfully, there are historians who they love this stuff. I mean, Glenn Richardson in particular has written a lot about Henry VIII and Francis I exchanging servants of the Privy Chamber and how that cut through formalities because they had a personal connection to the other king by having one of their servants there. So I feel like I've there's enough of it in the book, certainly for my tastes. There's more out there if anyone wants any more. But yeah, so servants had to, mostly Privy Chamber servants in particular, were often sent by kings and queens abroad to act as ambassadors. So Francis Bryan, yeah, he had a great career in that. I think in large part as well because he spoke many languages, but also he was a good cipherer, which was obviously important for exchanging correspondence. And so there is actually a surprising amount of evidence for this because a lot of the reports sent back from the ambassadors do survive. And they actually are surprisingly rich in material. Like, not only do they detail instructions of what these missions entailed, like what exactly was Brian expected to do while he was away. They're great for that because they've survived and we actually know what the mission was for. But also, you get letters and reports back where they've talked about their first interaction with a king or a queen in France or in Spain. And then you get letters from the kings and queens of France and Spain, sort of recommending them and sort of saying, "Oh, your servant has been wonderful." I think there was even one instance. I struggle to remember who it is, but one of Edward VI's servants, um, the King of Spain, I think it is, or the Emperor, just refuses to let the servant go home because he's so like he's so pleased with him. You know, he wants him to be part of his court. And no doubt he the servant wanted to return home to England and for the longest time wasn't allowed to. So yeah, no, and there's a little bit of that in the book, but I think I would be wrong to say I'm the expert on that topic. There's definitely Glenn Richardson would be he's written quite a lot on it. He'd be great if you wanted to know more about that for sure.
That's perfect. Okay, I'm just going to ask you this one direct question about it.
Okay, yeah.
Let's say, hypothetically speaking, Sir Francis Bryan gives Thomas Seymour a letter to deliver to Henry VIII. Thomas Seymour goes to court to deliver it to the king. How close would he get as basically a nobody at that time? We're talking 1530 before his sister was even considered a queen consort. Would he get close to the king or would he have to hand it to somebody who would then give it to the king? Do you know?
I wouldn't I wouldn't be able to answer it definitely, but I would be willing to bet that because Sir Francis Bryan has entrusted him with the letter and Seymour could invoke Bryan's name in trying to gain access to the king, that Seymour would be let right through to the king to hand over the letter. And I think that these in between sort of the agents between servants and kings, as there were many sort of recorded, I think they were trusted people. You know, you wouldn't actually entrust someone who you who you didn't know
Right.
to undertake that task. I would imagine there could be something like Seymour arriving and handing it off to someone in the Privy Chamber because you could trust that gentleman to pass it on to the king. That's possible too. But I would imagine with important correspondence like this, that if Sir Thomas Seymour was trusted by Brian to carry that letter, he would have been also trusted by the king to be that sort of in-between person, one way or the other. And that might speak to a relationship that he had with the king, if not in evidence, but sort of the implication is there.
Thank you. I think that's kind of what I've assumed all along, but I wasn't
Sure.
sure, and I really wanted to bounce that off of you to see what you
I might
thought
try
about
and
that.
I'll try and find you a more definite answer for sure. But yeah,
Yeah.
my gut says that you were right about that.
Okay. All right. I like to hear that. Okay. Speaking of guts,
Okay.
gonna wonder where this is going, right?
Right. Yeah. I don't remember
Okay.
guts in my book. But yes, go on.
Sorry. Okay, the groom of the stool. Okay, we
Oh, right.
know,
Okay.
right? This is where it's going. The groom of the
Oh, yeah.
stool. We know what an important role this was and how it gave you close access to the king. Now I'm going to throw in a
Sure.
curveball here. Was there a similar position in the queen's household?
Right. Yes. I'm gonna say no, because of all the records that have survived of in consort's household, so Elizabeth of York and Henry VIII's queens, there are enough records that if there was a groom of the stool, which would obviously be female,
Mhm.
then we would know because every other office is listed. You know, you have I think when Anne of Cleves becomes queen, Cromwell does such a revamp of the household. It's not the most ambitious revamp, but he does it, that there is actually a very full record of what the household looked like in 1540. And there's no mention of a groom of the stool for Anne of Cleves. So no doubt, I think it's a very safe assumption that one of her ladies and gentlewomen would have performed that office. However, there was, I believe, and I think I struggled to find the reference myself, but it's definitely repeated quite often in books. There is one woman in Elizabeth I's household who is named Groom of the Stool. I don't know if maybe I didn't look hard enough or maybe I didn't feel important enough. I don't know. But I think it's often said that that one instance where it's recorded suggests that always it had been one lady or one gentlewoman who had been designated, but there'd been no need to specifically identify them normally. And that's just probably just a clerical difference. So someone just assumed that they had the role of groom of the stool because everyone already knows that that's that lady's responsibility. There is also, I think I make the comparison. I'm not sure if it's in this book or if it's in Courting Scandal because it's about Jane, but the fact that Lady Jane Rochford and Sir William Compton, who was Henry VIII's groom of the stool, had many sort of parallels in the sense that she had lodgings one stairway away from the bedchamber, which you would have to if you were the groom of the stool, and was a lady of the Privy Chamber in that sense. No doubt the most trusted servant of Catherine Howard when she was Lady of the Privy Chamber, and even facilitated an extramarital affair. Well, I shouldn't say that with such fact, but you know what I'm saying.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, yeah. As William Compton did for Henry VIII. There's so many parallels that it's a safe assumption to me that Lady Jane Rochford was Catherine Howard's groom of the stool, even if she never actually had that title. So that's a long way of answering your question of yes, there would have been an equivalent on the Queen's side, and it would have been a woman.
Yeah, interesting. James, I am in awe over the research that you had to do for this book. I mean, it's one thing if you pick one subject. Let's say your book on Jane Boleyn, right? Lady Rochford.
Right.
That's one subject. And within that subject, you can determine how deep you want to go. But with such a broad subject like the servants of the Tudors, I can't even fathom how you could determine where the end line was on how far you deep in or how far you dig deep into something. How I don't even I'm in
It's
awe.
It was a nightmare. I appreciate that. Thank you. I mean, I hope it comes across that it was a lot of work
Yeah.
because I don't think I'll rush to do such a broad topic again because my main anxiety all the way through it was how do I summarize this in one book? Honestly, it could be several. There is enough material. At the same time, there's nowhere near enough material. Like
Mm.
my chapter on livery is shorter than the other chapters for a reason. There is just not much more to say, or there isn't enough to detail to get real depth of the material, you know. I wanted it to be sort of in that sense pacey and not too heavy and not too detailed, but at the same I couldn't resist putting so many more anecdotes in. And even when I knew the book was long enough, I was still adding more, only later on to have to find I'm like 5,000 words over the limit and I have to take off some more. It really I think it wouldn't have worked if I didn't love the topic already. That's the main thing. I really that is my interest, royal servants, and you could give me any king or queen from any period, and I would immediately ask, well, what about their household? What about the people who surrounded them? I don't care about who's king that or queen whoever. I just
Yeah.
want to know who were the people surrounding them, why were they important, what were their roles? And one thing that I regret about this book, if anything, is that because of the it would be impossible is that not the people themselves might not come through as in their fuller lives. I tried to summarize that sort of at the end of the book that all of these people, there's like hundreds of names in this book, had their own lives, their own careers, their own families, their own obligations. But we specifically talk about them in the book about their role as a servant, There's so much more, like this is like an iceberg, there's so much more that we could unravel about these people, but I hoped with this book to cover, at least on the surface, what their job was like, what it was like to be a servant. And I tried to stick with that as close as possible, otherwise it would have been a very tiring biography of like 100 people.
Right.
So yeah, there's although it seems like a massively broad topic, often my research was like very fixed in the sense of like this is what's available. We have the last wills and testaments of servants. So how can I use that? But if they don't survive, if there's certain material that doesn't survive, like certain kinds of petitions or certain sort of letters I think there's actually an inference in the book about how sometimes letters say this servant went to conduct this affair or went on this queen's business, but actually doesn't say what the affair or the business is. And
Mm.
that's just the nature of the material. They didn't need to
Yeah.
write it down. And if they didn't need to write it down, it remains their secret. We will never know what that business or what that affair was, but that's just makes it all the more tantalizing, I think.
Yeah. I love all of your books. I love the anecdotes that
Thank
you
you.
include that I think that makes your books so much different than some of the other ones out there. And it makes them a little bit more human, especially with a subject like this, to be able to see that human side of it. But it also gives you just a little taste of these servants themselves to want to go and do maybe some more research on your own. And I love that too. It's like, here's a little tidbit about this person. And oh, wait, now I want to go learn about them. And I love that about history.
I couldn't ask for better feedback. I'm so pleased because if it inspires other people to want to learn more about these people, then that's great. Because I could never do them all justice in one book. They all have their own, as I say, individual lives, and they could all be extraordinary for one reason or another. I'm just picking at this one specific facet of their life.
Yeah.
But to hear for you to say that, I'm really grateful. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, good. I highly recommend this book. If you're listening or if you're watching right now, please go out and pick up James's book, Serving the Tudors. James, what have you been up to? Yeah, there it is, Serving the
Yeah, there
Tudors.
it is.
I'll include links and everything in the show notes. James, what have you been up to since writing this book?
Oh God, sleeping. Sleeping a lot. Yeah, I have a real problem because I don't like having too much free time. I like to keep busy, and I do enjoy research so much. And anyone will tell you, I mean, you'll know yourself from researching Seymour, when you're researching a topic, there's something very addictive about it.
Yeah.
And I know I need to take a break. I need to take a break. Like I'm going to take a break. And the reality is, I have exhausted all of my research reserves. So I've been a PhD student what feels like forever, or was a PhD student forever, and I had all this material, and I had been sort of hoarding it and keeping it aside. Now it's pretty much all out there. I have nothing left. So it's now time for me to go back to the drawing board and think, researching from scratch, what's the next topic? But I need to take a break, and we all need to take a break. But
Yes.
someone needs to force me to, because I've only really rested for maybe a month since this book has come out, month and a half. And I still am thinking in my back of my mind, like I could be walking around the park and I'd be thinking, Anne Boleyn's household. I want to do something on Anne Boleyn's household. It's like, no, someone needs to take my laptop off me and say, no, no, you need to relax. You need to take a break. So what I've been doing is a lot of sleeping and a lot of like reluctantly, a lot of thinking about what I'm going to do next. But yes, I highly recommend a very long sleep after this kind of project. It's the only thing for it.
Yeah, you have to rejuvenate yourself after a
Definitely.
project like this because the next one, whatever the next topic is, it'll come to you on one of your walks or while you're
For sure.
sleeping,
Yeah.
and you'll have this light bulb moment where you go, "This is it. I know this is what I need to do." You'll do some preliminary research and you'll go, "Oh my gosh, yep, this is exactly what." And I can't wait to find out what that's going to be from you. I'm excited.
I'm excited too. That's interesting. I have no idea what it is, and I actually need to get back to doing more reading. There's so many
Yeah.
great books that have come out this year that I haven't had a chance to read yet. And I know that's where the inspiration comes from. I mean, my inspiration to write about Jane Boleyn initially came from how others were writing about Jane Boleyn
Yeah.
and the narratives about Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard and how Jane figured into them. So I've always been inspired by other people's work, and I think I need to sit down and have a moment to just read, and not just Tudor history. I want to read a bit wider. You get a bit stuck when you're researching, don't you? You just like
Yeah.
you keep the same thing over and over again, but actually you can find inspiration in other work and in other books and even like unpublished PhD theses and things like that. I would like to get back to reading more widely, but we'll see. You know, as soon as I've got that topic in mind, I'm like obsessed. I won't be able to stop, so I'm just going to resist the urge for now.
You get a little bit of that tunnel vision going on, huh?
You do, you do. Yes. Honestly, other things don't matter. That's the problem. It's like
Yeah.
oh my, even just it's not good. It's not healthy, but it's a lot of fun. I would
Well,
highly recommend it. If any of your listeners have want to research something for themselves, just go for it. Just, you know, you don't need any qualifications or anything. You should just, the passion will get you there.
yes, it definitely will. And I can so relate to the reading part inspiring you. I cannot tell you how many times I've picked up a book and started reading, and I read one specific sentence, and I'm like, oh, I got to put this book down for a second. I got to run off and go do this for a while because that just
Yeah.
inspired me.
No, I love that about books, I have to say. Yeah.
I,
I think anyone who wants to research or wants to write, they need to start by reading. It sounds
yes.
obvious, but I can sit myself down with a draft sometimes and be writing, and I realize the reason it's not working is because I need to go and read. I need to read more. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I always forget that because you get so, as you say, tunnel visioned into a topic. But
Yes.
sometimes it's better to just put it down and try and find inspiration somewhere else.
Dr. James Taff, thank you so much for coming on the show again and talking about this subject with us.
No, thank you, Rebecca. So honestly, anytime, it's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. If you love the show and would like to show your support, please head on over to my Patreon page. That's Patreon, patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty for more information. Over there, you're going to find commercial-free episodes. You'll get early access, and there's some exclusive content as well, with more stuff to come as I'm rebuilding it. Also, recently I returned from England and cannot wait to go back. But this time I would love to bring you with me. So if you're interested to go on a tour of England with me, why don't you send me an email, Rebecca@tudorsdynasty.com for more information. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.